we have this pattern of the starving artist. We have this narrative culturally. We have the opportunity now to shift that into creating a creator economy. Artists of America, there's this whole movement to sort of build another creative economic system where we're able to support artists. And I think you see in like larger institutions too, they're leaning more towards like, how can we give grants that support people instead of just for materials for their practice?
Hi, Al. How are you?
Great. Good morning.
So it's good to have you here. I'm excited to dive in and hear all things about community development and artists and DIY space. First, let's start about some of the challenges that you see when you're working in communities and with artists on the ground.
Absolutely. I think what I see is this pattern of development, happening to communities rather than with communities. We see with multiple, sort of neighborhoods that become these collections of artists, whether it's because there's a building there that's housing multiple studios, or artists in retail spaces are organizing to do markets. It starts to build momentum and attract more people. And that attraction, over a span of like 10 years can turn into, some very significant developments that tends to sort of really have a strong effect on the artists that are, sort of sparking this energy. And so how do we shift that pattern, right? Instead of, artists come, then development comes and artists sort of filter out. How do we keep those artists? How do we integrate them into these communities that we're building? Because as the attractive force, there's value in their presence. So how do we sort of nurture that?
Yeah, and I think this is something that is valid anywhere you go, right? We always hear about the artists are the first ones to come in and revitalize an area. It attracts coffee shops and retail, and then developers come in and then they get priced out. So what are some ideas, if anything, that you or your peers have when we look to break this cycle? How do we get over this? Because it's a conversation that we've been having for a really long time.
Absolutely. And I've actually been looking at other developments that are intentionally integrating the arts. And for example, ArtSpace has a whole portfolio of intentionally affordable or attainable housing that integrates studio space in like a retail first floor, or integrates programming for the arts into these spaces. Another really cool example is called Trilith in Atlanta, Georgia. And it's a massive campus. We're talking acres of real estate that is integrating the production side of things. So they do full scale movie production in these spaces. And that's sort of what attracts more creatives there. But from the get-go, it's like, how do we get people, or how do we nurture that creative process through our offering?
Talk to me a little bit about your work with artists in real estate.
Knowing the pattern of artists occupying space and attracting development, imagining how we can integrate artists on the front end from the development side and create spaces for them in the future communities that we're building that nurtures that creative economy. That's something that I think, is happening in other cities, but really trying to create more space and integrate art into the identity of the city that we're building through development is huge. Whether it's collaborating with artists during a project, including murals or including studio spaces. Are we building studio spaces into our developments? Are we creating retail opportunities for artists? As well as, what kind of conversations are we having with art communities when we're sort of bringing new developments into the space?
Can you give me a hypothetical? It doesn't have to be an actual project or anything that you're working on, but we talked, about the pattern of artists coming in, revitalizing an area, and then being pushed out because they're being outpriced. Can you give me a hypothetical, perfect world? What's a vision that you would have for an intersection or an area of town that you see could be or should be the future?
Absolutely. I think there's a lot of exploration in the co-op model, as well as what happens when there's nonprofit ownership. and how do you sort of create an organization that is able to, hold down the timeline of property ownership, but also provide that accessibility, whether it is a individual ownership through a co-op model or the nonprofit method. There's even, sort of working with the land bank to own the land, and then the organization owns the improvements. There's a lot of different ways that, nonprofits or artists can start that process. And there is support through grant funding. That is awesome to hear that, more and more artists have the opportunity to own their space, because that sort of protects them in the long run as things change.
Do we see hope in financially having artists being able to afford space, or is it something that we need to reevaluate? Again, you talked about the co-op. Is it like a rent to own, lease to own type situation?
That's one way of doing it. There's also the way of, maybe the nonprofit is the co-op entity, and then there's a payment towards rent that is part of that goes towards, buying their own studio or buying their own retail space at a certain point. I think creating retail condos might be a good opportunity for artists to start building equity, because it's commercial and residential space too, right? Like, how do you create opportunities for wealth building and scalability for artists?
Your consultant work integrates sustainability, technology, art, real estate. How do you see the mix of those spurring positive impact?
Yeah, thank you for asking. I think the future is full of opportunities for us to rethink how we're financing projects, how we're building projects, how we're creating opportunities for artists. This could be that condo model that uses sustainable materials, that's documented on a blockchain, that people are, have ownership that's documented through technology ledgers, things that are transparent and decentralized. A lot of opportunities for like shifting patterns and the way things have been done, and reimagining, as a self-governing organization, how are we, creating systems and processes that utilize these decentralized models to create opportunities.
So do you think that it starts with local governments? Does it start with like community associations? Is it with developers? How do we start this conversation to get those stakeholders to see the value of investing in creatives?
Absolutely. The answer is yes. It's a all hands on deck
Okay.
solution. So ArtSpace, for example, is public-private partnerships. The city is involved. The state is involved. They're part of the conversation and part of the funding stack for these projects. And, when you're talking about development happening with communities, that's where the stakeholders come in. So, for example, you have a community where artists are and development is happening. How do we have the stakeholders that are the artists as well be a part of that process? And I think that there's efforts there, but we're learning, right? We're in a learning stage of how do we do this the most effectively that feels good and has the best impact and best outcomes.
It's interesting. I had a conversation a couple weeks ago with an artist, writer, poet, and we were talking about accessibility, arts accessibility, and how organizations oftentimes will talk about that being important in their mission. But she raised a point that I hadn't thought of before, which is when we talk about accessibility, how accessible are we making art making for artists? Meaning, if artists can't find sustainable work, or if they're constantly worrying about how am I going to pay rent or utilities because work is scattered, that's challenging to the creative process. So those individuals that we rely on for art as enjoyment, inspiration, innovation, they're struggling on their own to even create that. Does that resonate at all with you and
It does.
conversations you have?
Absolutely, it does. We have this pattern of the starving artist. We have this narrative culturally. We have the opportunity now to shift that into creating a creator economy. Artists of America, there's this whole movement to sort of build another creative economic system where we're able to support artists. And I think you see in like larger institutions too, they're leaning more towards like, how can we give grants that support people instead of just for materials for their practice? Like, how do we sort of subsidize the artist in a way that makes it they're able to thrive and shift that narrative away from the starving artist? And so that's really exciting to see action and financing for the artists. I think at the public level, like cities have a lot of opportunities with things like the bed tax, where a lot of funding goes to the arts. And then now strategically, how do we distribute that to artists so that they can thrive and create work and have a living?
Yeah, and you mentioned starving artists a couple times, and I know in talking with individuals in the sector, they really don't like that phrase. You know, they want to get over this notion that, oh, I'm a starving artist. And you all, the gallery that you're affiliated with, had a really interesting campaign where it was the Pay Artists campaign. Talk to me about where that came about, how that came about, and where that is today.
Absolutely. So that campaign spurred out of the idea that exposure is not enough. You know, art is essential. Art is work. We should be paying artists. And so the campaign came out of this desire for the gallery to attain wage certification, which is started in the UK, sort of baseline. You know, there's no fees to submit your art for show. We pay artists a stipend when they show their work. We have a good split. We're doing 70-30 now, starting 2025. And so, we had a great campaign season. We were awarded before that campaign a significant stipend that allowed us to meet our marks in 2025, where we'll be applying for wage certification because we won't have application fees.
So let's shift to gallery fees, etc. So
yeah.
I had a gallery for about 7 years and worked on commission, but it was a 50-50 split. I completely understand the notion of wanting to pay artists as much as possible. Where in the 70-30 split of the gallery, how do you support the function of the gallery, paying people that work there, etc.? I personally never got paid when I had the gallery, which is not something that I often talk about publicly. Anything that I made went back into putting on the next show. And as you can imagine not bringing in a livelihood during that time. It was a lot of work. And so I think gallerists, in the sense, provide the platform for artists. They also provide marketing. They give artists that established recognition. How does a 70-30 split work with the gallery in being just covering operating costs?
So 934 Gallery is a nonprofit, all volunteer run gallery. Operates as more of a community center with opportunities for artists to show their work. We have monthly shows, a festival every year called 934 Fest, which is really fun. And so that, because it's not a profit-driven enterprise, it is able to sort of have those lower operating costs, especially, because it's volunteer run. Because we are doing a 70-30 split and we're giving stipends to each artist that is showing their work at $200, I believe. That commitment was sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy in that we were granted $20,000 to continue the campaign and have those funds available to support artists. So it's sort of shifting into, we're getting funds so that we can distribute them, basically.
So you're heavily reliant then on grants, donations to support the artists, whereas the selling of the art isn't as relied upon as perhaps grants, public funding, donations, things like that.
Correct.
So let's shift to the technology art and this kind of forward-looking art exhibitions that you work on. I think this is really fascinating. Describe a little bit about the Mural remix and some of the tech that you're incorporating into public art.
Yeah, Mural remix started in 2021 on a front porch during COVID. We were some digital artists that were really craving community in a time of isolation. Digital artists, I feel like, are already somewhat isolated. And so shifting that and coming together to really create unique spaces, and just started doing pop-up shows on murals with projectors and utilizing animations to bring those murals to life. And it really has gained a ton of momentum. We got our 501c this year, and now we were at a huge light art festival. We're growing in a really powerful way because I think there is this sort of desire to create unique and fresh new media immersive experiences.
What are you hearing from artists on the ground regarding their work being supported and kind of being able to experiment and push the boundaries and discovering new ways of working?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of support for artists that are trying new things. And there's a lot of collaborative spirit that I'm seeing where people are coming together. Oh, you're doing digital arts, I'm doing ceramics. How do we come together and integrate these to create something new?
How would you, or what advice would you give someone listening who's in their own community and kind of wants to bring together a 934 type gallery?
Absolutely. Finding a space and creating a cadence. I think if you show up at the same place, same time every month, it might take a year, but momentum will occur and you'll start having, people that know that this is happening. They're ready to come and check it out. And I think that having a cadence and consistency is really valuable.
How do you build awareness and get the word out that you even have a space and are doing these types of exhibitions?
I think collaboration is the best way to bring people together to say, hey, you have this idea. Let's see how we can build something off of that. Let's see what we can do when we have all of these different people with these different styles, with these different visions, and come together and create something that has a little bit of everybody's touch.
It sounds like word of mouth plays a big role in a lot of the outreach.
Absolutely. And social media is something that I've seen a lot of benefit from, and that's something that artists are pretty good at naturally, even though it's like not everybody's favorite thing.
So a lot of times when I interact with either higher ed or corporate leaders and we think of business entrepreneurs, artists don't come to mind, I think, first and foremost. What would you say to artists as entrepreneurs?
I think you have to be an entrepreneur to be an artist or to, put yourself out there. A lot of the applications that you're filling out, you're really like selling yourself in a way, sort of putting your opportunities or your ideas in a way that makes sense to someone else, that sparks intrigue, that creates that mystery where someone wants to see your work and learn more and see from your perspective. I think that the creativity and business are so aligned. I think business is an expression of, the human spirit as much as art is. So the parallels there are very strong, even though it might not appear that way on the surface. Marketing, I've found, is a really big bridge of that gap.
Are there barriers to entry when it comes to applications, applying for grants? I just had a conversation yesterday with someone who said that although this funder thinks that they're making the process easy, it's actually more difficult and more challenging. What are some messages that we could send to funders on how to better either prepare or assist or make the process for applying for funding easier?
Yeah, I've seen workshops and opportunities for open office hours to sort of, have a conversation about the process during the process. That's really helpful instead of, I'm filling this out, I'm submitting it, and I'll get feedback. But there's the opportunity to stop by with the team and say, hey, this is what I'm working on. Do you have any feedback? And then that back and forth, will definitely be helpful in refining the application.
So it sounds like your advice is to those applying, take advantage of those workshops or office hours that are made available to assist them.
Absolutely.
Well, I think that we are coming to the time in the conversation where I finish out with asking everybody the same two questions. So I'm going to dive in with you, Al, and say, how do you define art?
Oh, I love that question. Okay, so I define art as everything. I see all of creation as a work of art at a spiritual level. And because of that, the way that we interact with people, the way that we build community, the way that we plan for the future is all part of the process in creating a brighter future, which is, in my mind, the Gesamtkunstwerk, or master work of art that I think we're collectively working towards, whether we know it or not.
That's really great. And I think visualizing that building community, as you describe, is artistic. It is something that has to be thoughtful and include vision and a visionary and to get something off the ground.
Absolutely.
So lastly, we'll end it with, what color do you love the most and why?
I do love a citron, a limey green. Love that color. Absolutely.
What is it about a citron green that you love?
It makes me smile when I see it. I think it brightens up the day. There's a lot of gray in the world, especially during this time of year in Ohio. So a little pop here and there, a little neon, never hurt anybody.
So it's definitely evokes a feeling.
Yes, absolutely.
That's great. Well, Al, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you. My pleasure.